Well, welcome all of you to this virtual walk, which taking in some of Wokingham's pubs. The interesting thing about this one is that it's all my own work, well, sort of, as opposed to Ulm and Dorchester, which, Sally did and I helped a bit, and the Woodley Walk, which Leslie did and I helped a bit, but this is all mine. Now, we can't include all of the Wokingham pubs, even for a Zoom, so I'm going to do a walk around the town centre, and I'll show you some photos of one or two other bits and pieces as well. But how did I get this information? Well, it's based on a project I did when I joined the U3A. I first joined the local history group and a photography group. The history group's project was to emulate an existing booklet about life in Wokingham around 1851, based on the census of that year. That's the one on the left here. That was created by a group from Oxford University in 1984. Following the publication of the census for 1901, that's 50 years later, the idea was to use the same chapter structure, and I chose to do one called Public Houses, Inns, Beer Houses and Breweries. This wasn't difficult, so after I'd done this, I expanded it to do my own project as part of the U3A photography group, with notes and photos of all the known pubs in 1901 and the corresponding photo, where possible, of it 100 or so years later. I did all this in 2011. So these are the main sources for my research. The Inns and Public Houses of Wokingham, that's a major contribution. That's the book to read if you can get hold of it. You might be able to find it in the library. There was an interesting little place called Dead Pubs. That's the second one. Public Houses, Inns and Taverns of Wokingham. That was a website that somebody set up specializing in no longer existing pubs. And they had quite a few from Wokingham, and that was quite useful. And in return, I gave them some of the research that I did to put on their website. Then, of course, there's the census data for Wokingham that we are basing this document around. And of course, I borrowed or bought the following, little booklets from the Wokingham Society, old photographs, pictorial histories, and of course, there's always Wikipedia and Googling things. So as I said, I started this project with my interest in trying to match an old photo with one of the same subject from today, from the same perspective. And here's a couple of examples. The Duke's Head on the top, that one worked out pretty well. You can see when I was taking the right-hand picture, chap came out and crossed over the road to me. He said, "Excuse me, why are you taking photographs of my pub?" So I had to explain what I was doing. The one at the bottom, the old leather and bottle down the Barkham Road, I couldn't quite get the angle exactly right, but that's the sort of thing I've been trying to do. So let's start by defining the terminology that we're using. Beer houses, public houses, inns or taverns, and breweries. Breweries, well, under a banner of reducing public drunkenness, the Beer Act of 1830 introduced a new lower tier of premises permitted to sell alcohol, which became known as beer houses or ale houses. At the time, beer was viewed as harmless, nutritious, and even healthy compared with gin, which a lot of people drank, and even water sometimes. Under the 1830 Act, any householder who paid rates could apply with a one-off payment of 2 guineas to sell beer or cider at his home, usually from the front door, and also brew his own on his premises. So much easier than getting a license for a pub. And in the first year, 400 beer houses opened, and within 8 years, 46,000 opened across the country, far outnumbering the combined total of long-established taverns and public houses and inns and hotels. But the Wine and Beer House Act of 1869, that's 40 years later, reintroduced the stricter controls of the previous century. And now the sale of beers and wines or spirits required a license for the premises from the local magistrates. Ooh, much harder. And these are now what we know as public houses or pubs. Although these new laws prevented any new beer houses from being created, those already in existence were allowed to continue, and many didn't fully die out till nearly the end of the 19th century. A lot of beer houses applied for a new public license and became full public houses, but of course, quite a lot just closed down, couldn't be bothered. And the other thing is that, of course, beer houses belong to the owner, but many public houses were and still are owned by breweries who rent them out to the licensee for an annual fee, and usually, it's the important thing, restricted what they could sell. Inns or taverns are generally establishments where travellers can seek lodging and usually food and drink. And they're typically located in the country or along a highway, particularly on a coaching route. Traditionally, they're bigger than pubs, they're more important locally, often used for public meetings and the like. So in some ways, you can treat them like small hotels, but primarily for travellers, not for long stays. Taverns are a bit like inns, but slightly more lower class. And we know what breweries are, of course. And in some ways, beer houses were breweries, but we tend to assume that they might sell their own own beer from their own house, like microbreweries sell from their own premises, but breweries own pubs, and the pubs sell their beer for them. So let's get down to Wokingham. Here's a little list of all the pubs we know about in Wokingham. Oh, quite a lot. Don't worry about the details. It's a bit overwhelming, but it's all the pubs and inns ever mentioned that we've got a name for, and some mention somewhere. If you look at the first column, that's when it was first mentioned in any document anywhere. The second column is the last time it was mentioned. The column with blue yeses on is if it still existed in 1900, and the yellow ones here, if it still existed in around about 2000. So we start with 95 altogether. Then we dig in 1900, it's down to 37. We look at 2000, now it's down to 20. That's a bit more easy to manage. Here's a typical example with the lovely name, the chopping knife, which was first mentioned in 1623, but never heard of again. The Coach and Horses, and it's ditto, but at least we know where it was. The Cricketers was around in 1900, but not now. The Crispin and the Crooked Billet were then and still are. So that's how that works. And now we get down to, if we just concentrate on the town centre around about 1900, there's about 36. But if you get to 2000, how many are left? It's about 12. Oh, that makes it a lot easier. So 12, I think we can manage that. So we're going to have a look at all the pubs. The ones with the green ones are all the pubs in the town centre in 1900. And the ones with a cross in are those that are still around in around about 2000. As I said, it goes down from about 36, I think, altogether, down to about 12. So here's the route we're going to do. We'll start at the station, up Station Road to the top, along Broad Street, up Rose Street, round the corner, down Peach Street, down Denmark Street, and back to where we started, with a couple of little minor diversions off left and right, but mainly that's the route we're going to do. So let's start at the station. And we know what's at the station. It's the railway, or the Molly Miller, or the station tap, depending on when you're taking a picture of it. Now, as well as this Beer Act, which suddenly made everybody who wanted to sell beer able to sell it for a very small price. The other important thing that affected the beer trade, the alcoholic trade, was the railway. And the completion of the railway line from London to Reading in 1840 resulted in the total demise of the stagecoach service from London to Bath and Bristol by 1843, in 3 years, and the loss of lots of trade for all the inns along the Bath Road. But there was some service, diminished service between Reading and London via Wokingham, with just one stagecoach a day calling at the Rose Hotel. And the coming of the railway also had a considerable effect on Wokingham's licensed trade. This pub, the Railway, surprise, was built next to the station by Haywoods Brewery. And then they opened the South Western Railway to London from Wokingham in 1856, and that gave Wokingham a direct link to the capital. Overall, the railways brought more travellers to the town and a great impetus to the beer trade. The railway, as it was initially named in 1849, became next the Railway Tavern and then the Railway Hotel as its fortunes flourished. In 1856, it was bought by the Wellington Brewery, and by 1901, it had a larger trade than the Rose Hotel in the middle of town. There's a little annex on the left-hand side over here of the old photograph called the Railway Tap. That was sort of at the back for those customers who weren't as wealthy as the patrons of the hotel. So the riffraff went to the beer house round the back. By 2000, it had become the Molly Miller and was demoted sort of to a pub instead of a hotel. And now it's been renamed again as the Station Tap. So our route goes up Station Road, but first let's have just a quick look down Barkham Road. Second on the right, down Barkham Road, is the Three Brewers. It started as an alehouse in the 1850s, and by 1869, it was owned by the Simmons Brewery. And in 2012, it was sold for redevelopment. It's now a smart pair of semis. Now we will go up Station Road. And at the top, on the left, we all know what this is. This is the Hope and Anchor, the top of Station Road. The right-hand side part of the building still occupies this 15th century house, while the other end of the bar was formerly a smithy, but this wasn't built until the second half of the 19th century, after the pub had been around for some years. The garage and the entrance to the garden were also built about the same date. That's on the left-hand side. You can see over on the old picture, that would be where you took your cars or your carriages in there. Nowadays, it's an entrance to the garden. It was built in 1840, and in 1901, at the time of the old photograph, it's obvious it was owned by Baker, Powell and Company, the Wellington Brewery that was based in Broad Street. And you can see they said, wow, we do good stabling and cyclists, and they got a bagatelle, and they sell fine ales. Obviously, very popular place, and not too far from the station as well. So just come up the road, there you go. And at the top of Station Road, we cross over to the terrace, and number 23 is the Queen's Head. Photograph top left shows the unmade surface of Shoot End down past the terrace, and the Queen's Head is there, you can see on the right-hand side of that picture there. This building, which dates from the 15th century, is notable as the only building in Wokingham known to have a cruck frame as part of its construction. This little diagram at the bottom here shows a cruck frame is you build a wooden arch and then build the walls and the roof around the arch. This is a feature that's relatively common in northern England, but less so in the southeast. There's only 7 buildings of this kind of construction known in Berkshire. There's no mistaking the sort of things they sell here. On the left here it says Hewitt and Company celebrated ales and stouts and foreign spirits. On the right-hand side, quite a lot of it still remains the same. The sign, the support for the sign, in sign are on these dormer windows at the top, 1, 2, 3. They're exactly the same as they were before. A little bit further away from town, at number 37, is the Anchor, what it was. It opened in 1777. In 1901, it was just 6 doors away from the Queen's Head, but it closed in 1910 and it's now a private house. Of course, in those days, it was quite small and wouldn't sell a lot of things. The next one, the Queen's Aunt, was so much bigger, it could sell more interesting things. This one obviously lost its custom and eventually gave up. So now we go up along Broad Street, which is in towards town. And we come to where the Shades was. The Shades was a beer house, opened in 1851. After quite a bit of opposition from other breweries and all the well-to-do residents of Broad Street, it was in the front of the Wokingham Brewery in Broad Street. Rosalind Baker, a member of the brewing family, lived at the Shades, and the brewery was down behind it, just off the road. We'll carry on along to the end and turn left down Rose Street. In the old picture here, this is number 29, the Rose Street. This building at the right-hand end. 2 parts, the roof sloping and the roof sloping. This bit here, it's a 15th century building, but it's had lots of different uses, including from the start of the 20th century, that of a public house called the Cricketers. In this photograph, it had just been converted into a fish shop. On the right-hand side, it is almost exactly the same, just different colors. Everything else looks very similar. The bracket for the pub sign is just still there, stuck on the wall. That's obviously one of the well-known buildings in Rose Street. Cross over to the other side, a little bit further down, we get to the Metropolitan. Now, the old photograph shows a landlord and some of his customers outside the Metropolitan beer shop in Rose Street. This one is the owner. He's wearing a bowler hat and shirt sleeves. Building's a 15th century house, modified over the centuries to meet the needs of its owners. The sign on the newer one, called the Metropolitan, shows a guardsman standing against the London background. Nobody's quite sure why. There's no satisfactory explanation for the origin of the name. It might have been the whim of a particular landlord or something. And now it's been renamed the 56. Pretty obvious why it's called the 56. And it's a wine bar rather than a beer house. Obviously, that's what we have these days. And at the end of Rose Street, as we leave, on the right-hand side, the very last one is the White Hart, number 65. In 1901, this was one of 7 public houses in the short length of Rose Street. It was the home of the Rose family. We go out here, turn right, round the corner, into Peach Street, and of course, we get to the Ship Inn. Now, the oldest part of the present ship is this 17th century timber frame part, the main building there. It's been a lot altered. The original outer walls have been replaced with brick and some of the internal walls have been removed. Inside it had lots of beams. Some of the original ones are there, but some of them are replicas. They put steel girders in, cover them up with wood to make them look like wooden beams, where they've taken walls out and had to strengthen it. The western part of the building on the left was a blacksmith shop, and part of the building and part of the car park occupied the site of 3 of the 15th century West End almshouses, which are now on the opposite side of the road. I'm pleased to see that this is one of some pubs that still have a sign telling you what it is, the Ship Inn. The top one was one that I took probably in 2010, and the other one is what it's got now, the Ship Inn. But it's still Fuller's, and it's still got a nice sign. We walk along Peach Street a little bit, and where East Hampstead Road comes in from the left, On the right where the shops are, there was once a pub called The Star. Why? Well, if you go down East Hampstead Road, bottom, you get to the Star Lane level crossing. And the cottage on the right, next to the railway, poor things, it's called Star Lane Cottage. Got it? Pretty obvious. Anyhow, at the very top of East Hampstead Road, or Star Lane, if you like, we have, here are number 1, the Victoria Arms. The original house was one of a pair of late 18th century brick tenements. And in 1847, the beer house was bought by Haywoods Brewery. Surprise, surprise. And the landlord was Henry Baldwin. In 1851, he bought the adjacent property and expanded his business, which was making coaches, not just their wheels, and the business flourished. And then it was sold in 1861 to George Lush. George Lush, good name, did so well that within a few years, he was supplying coaches to the royal family. And the pub and the coach building firm were run by the same family from 1861 until 1907. Anyhow, we're back on Peach Street again. On the right is the Riddance. This is one of the new buildings, relatively speaking, new, in this part of Wokingham. It later on became the Riddance, as originally built in 1842 as part of the redevelopment of this site, which used to be Hall's Academy, a former private school. The inn itself was rebuilt in 1869. Richard Arnold was the licensee in 1901, but in 1903 he lost his license and was fined 40 shillings and costs at the Brewster Sessions for permitting drunkenness. A little further on, and we're in Marketplace. At the top of Marketplace, these timber-framed 15th and 16th century buildings that make up much of present-day Bush Walk. They were previously part of the Bush Inn, which was originally called the Bull and Bush. You'll see as we go through this talk that quite a lot of pubs change their name over time. One or two even move around from one place to another. Very strange. After being a stagecoach stop for 100 years, by 1901, it had become a hotel, the Bush Hotel. And it closed in 1986 and is now turned into this shopping arcade. The pub-like sign was clear to see in 2011, although the sign's obviously a bit modern, but at least it's got a sign. It went missing for a bit, but I did have a look the other day and it's come back again. Perhaps they just took it off to clean it and put it back. Carry on down Marketplace, we get to, on the right, the Roebuck. It's a 16th century house that was enlarged and modified in the 16th and 20th century. Part of the building next to the coach entrance has been used as a shop since early in the 20th century. Prior to that, the frontage of the inn was double the width of what it is now. And in 2011, it was turned into a bar and grill called The Square One. That's the photo in the middle. And the coach entrance is still there on the right-hand side, behind that chap with the bike, you can see. And it's now both gone back to being the Roebuck again, with a nice sign to prove it. Further down is the Wheatsheaf, 14 and 15 Marketplace. This is a view from Marketplace looking down Denmark Street in 1901. Wheatsheaf is an early 19th century building, so it's relatively new. As can be seen, it wasn't tied to a brewery. It's fairly unusual. It sold Allsopp's ales, but also at the bottom, Stollery Brothers Wines and Spirits. It now belongs to Fatface. Now we go over the other side of the road, and here is the Rose. Pubs have often changed their names, but the Rose has had a very varied set of names and locations. The original Rose Inn was on the north side of Marketplace, not where it is now, on the opposite side, and had been around over 100 years when John Chaplin took over the lease from Molly Mogg. The new Rose, a different one, the new Rose was on Peach Street, created in 1772 by John Chaplin when he couldn't afford to renew the lease on the Rose. But it was closed in 1788 when his widow was able to lease the original Old Rose, which she later renamed the Rose. Very complicated. In 1844, the owner of the original Rose moved from the north side of Marketplace to the south, where he created the present building by combining two cottages. It was large enough to warrant being upgraded to the Rose Hotel. And the new Rose, where he left it, on the north side, was closed. So this is what we have now. First it was the Rose Hotel. Then it was renamed Ye Old Rose Inn. Sounds good. In 1989, the larger part became the Café Rouge, down the bottom left there. In 1992, it was bought by Whitbread and made into a beefeater restaurant and public house. And the smaller part on the right became the New Rose for a little bit, and then it was taken over by Nando's. And it's not finished yet. This is the final stage in the middle. It's all closed up. The current owners are Oakman Inns, and they were going to reopen it last year, but for various reasons, they obviously didn't get around to it. And they're going to rename it. What should we call it? The Rose Revisited or something? The New Rose? No, we'll have to think of something. And of course, oddly enough, the Rose, or whatever you like to call it, wasn't on Rose Street. But of course, Rose Street used to be called Rose Street, R-O-W-S, as in rows of houses, Rose Street. And then it later became Rose Street, R-O-S-E, sounds the same. Very confusing. Let's carry on down the Marketplace anyhow. On the left, a little bit further down from here, is the Red Lion. It's one of the oldest buildings in Wokingham. The entrance to the stables at the rear can still be seen clearly on the left-hand side. That's the archway there. And it's called Red Lion Path. If you go down there and look back at the pub from the far end of the path, it's obvious it's made up of a number of buildings of all different ages. When you go down a bit more, down to Denmark Street, the first pub you get to is the Lord Raglan. This building began as 3 cottages, side by side, built in the early 19th century. Thomas Searle was the landlord from 1830 when it was a 1-roomed alehouse until his death in 1887, by which time he was an inn with 5 bedrooms. Despite this humble beginning, it became Grade 2 listed in 1969. But the inside has been completely revamped and altered and opened up, so it doesn't bear any resemblance to the original. It's the outside that has to be kept carefully. Originally, it was called the Lord Raglan. When Green King Brewery took it over, it was renamed the Raglan. Then in 2019, the owner changed from Green King to the Big Smoke. Not many people have heard of them. Plans for a substantial redesign of the interior was submitted, and after years being closed, it was reopened and the name was restored to the original the Lord Raglan. And who was Lord Raglan? He was responsible for the charge of the Light Brigade, and he was the Duke of Wellington's military secretary. And finally, while I'm here, look at this sign on the top right of Moorland Brewery from Abingdon. You'll find a lot of pubs. In this case, it's on the left-hand side of the doorway as you go in. You can just see it built in there. It's very colourful, well looked after, and it's built into the building. Because they're built in the brickwork, you find a lot of pubs have got this sign, even though they're owned by somebody different. But they obviously keep that as a memento from the past. We carry on down near the end of Denmark Street and we get to the Duke's Head. originally, again, 3 cottages side by side, was first mentioned as a public house in 1795. On the left, you can see it's got 2 entrance doors, and they've now been closed up, just got windows there, and there's a modern entrance round on the left-hand side of the building. At the back, in the yard of the present public house, there's a 200-year-old building. It's now been restored and is used as a skittle alley. Now, there's another odd thing about this, the sign in the top right here, the Duke's Head. Well, it's a gentleman with a obviously perky sort of nose, and his head's peeping out of a Wellington boot. Makes a bit obvious which duke this Duke's Head's meant to be, Duke of Wellington. But Wellington was made a duke in 1814, whereas the name the Duke's Head appeared in 1791 when it's advertised in the Reading Mercury newspaper. So the pub's name is probably, well, it couldn't belong to Wellington, more likely a reference to the Duke of St Albans, who was Wokingham's High Steward during the 1700s. Now, we got down to the end of Denmark Street, carry on down the roundabout, turn right along Wellington Road, and we're soon back at the station. That's the end of the walk around town. I'd like to finish by mentioning 4 other pubs, a little way out from the town centre, which are interesting for different reasons. And after that, a few words on Wokingham's breweries, and then we're done. And the first of these interesting ones is the Crooked Billet. And we're going to do the Whoda Thought It, the Plow, and the 3 Frogs. The Crooked Billet. The name originates from medieval times, when the king declared that all premises that sold beer must have a sign up outside to inform the public about this. And of course, in those days, most people were unable to read. So there's no point putting up a pub sign saying the Crooked Billet. So the owner of this establishment used real ingenuity because a crooked billet refers to a twisted or crooked tree branch. So rather than pay to have a sign carved or painted, he just picked up a bent stick and hung it up outside, and everybody knew what it was. The other interesting thing about this pub, and quite a few others, is that there are various stories about it. Some might be true, some might not. It is sometimes difficult to know whether to believe any of them. There was a story that this building once stood on the other side of the road, and it was moved across to this side to avoid being flooded by the nearby Brook, or it was on the inside of the bend, and therefore when you're coming down the road you couldn't see where the pub was, so they moved it to the right hand side where it is now, so that it could be seen by people coming. Well, although it's possible that a timber frame building could be moved, it's highly unlikely. It's more likely that the road was moved to pass on the other side. Anyhow, whatever it happened, if it did, it was early in the 19th century. No sign of diversion has been found, and nobody knows. So the next one with an interesting name is the Whoda Thought It. The unusual name, first recorded in 1861, is said to have originated in a remark by the Duke of Wellington. We've heard about him. The story goes that travelling in the forest one day and feeling very thirsty, in the middle of nowhere, that's Wokingham to you and me, or Wokingham probably, yes. He's feeling thirsty. He suddenly found this pub. His exclamation, "Whoda thought it," became the name of the pub. Well, it's possible, but it's highly unlikely, because there are several other pubs by the same name in other parts of the country. And the pub wasn't even open when Windsor Forest existed, so highly unlikely. According to a historian, Brian Lillywhite, the name is thought to have been taken from the suggestion of a joker that the motto to the coat of arms of a certain wealthy baronet brewer should be Who'da thought it? Hops had bought it. And a third possibility, who knows? Sailors who were wounded in the Napoleonic Wars were recuperated in this part of the world. And one of the phrases they used when pleased about something was, by Woden and Thor, the Norse gods, Woden and Thor. By Woden and Thor. And this got corrupted over time into, Whoda Thought It? Take your pick. I don't like any of those. The pub was closed and demolished in 2003. And the area has been redeveloped as a small residential estate. But when I was doing this, Barnett's street map of Wokingham, around about 2000, which still included this pub as if it was here. So I know exactly where it was. Right, the third of our interesting buildings is the Plow. The earliest known licensee in 1850 was Charles Johnson. Within a year, his wife had taken over the license. And like so many other small pubs, the income from it was too small to support a family, so Charles became a mailman. 2 years later, the Johnsons had gone, and the licensee was Thomas Rance, the first of the Rance family, who ran the Plow until 1911. It's assumed that they gave their name to Rance's Lane, just across the road. But the odd thing is that prior to the establishment of a public house called The Plow on the west side of Plow Lane, there's a beer house on the east side of the lane, the opposite side. Old maps show its whereabouts, but exactly when it swapped sides, it's not clear. Here's some maps. Here's 1883, and we've got a beer house here, where I've circled it, and it says BH, The Plow. Now we've moved on a bit, and the Plow's still there. You can see the building. There's nothing else on Plow Lane, but at least we know it's called Plow Lane. Now it's swapped sides, and the Plow Inn is on the left-hand side, and the building it used to be is still there. So it flipped over sometime. We don't know exactly when. We have a Google view. You can see that I put a red ring around where it used to be there, and the Loch Fyne, who's taking it over now, on the left-hand side of Plow Lane. So one on one side, one on the other. And if we have a street view, we can see that this set of four little buildings, that would have been the beer house as it was originally. And of course, go back in, you can see that they've changed the road. When they did the roundabout at the end, the road, instead of just going round straight past and then down here, they built a little lay-by here with a Layby Cafe, and so changed things around a little bit. Okay, the last of my specials is the Three Frogs. Not just because I live over the other side of the road, but it's very interesting, yes. The Three Frogs was first licensed as a pub in 1770, although the cottages that are now the heart of the building are much older. And although this public house was once a private house, known by the name of Frog Hall, it's been so much altered, particularly in recent years, that it's hard to see anything in the original building. And of course, Frog Hall is now the building at the end of Frog Hall Drive. This black and white picture on the right shows a panel of judges viewing a pub sign for the Three Frogs, which was the winning entry in a competition at the Brewers and Allied Traders exhibition at Olympia in London, 4th of October, 1954. So why was it called Frog Hall? Well, it was thought to be named after the animals themselves, because there are lots of those in this area. Used to be very boggy. And now the pub's been called the Three Frogs for over 200 years. Nobody's worked out why it's called the Three Frogs. Now here's four choices. You take your pick. Number one, it was run by three Frenchmen. Three Frogs. Huh. Secondly, the publican tried spicing up the menus by adding frog's legs, speciality of the house. Well, whether that went down well or not, we don't know. It's across the road from Frog Hall at the end of Frog Hall Drive. We don't know. But the one I think is best is it used to have a sign depicting 3 sheaves of corn. But the artist was so incompetent that the locals took the mickey and renamed it the Three Frogs. Anyhow, we'll never know. Now on the final stretch, we'll just cover the 3 big breweries and a little one that used to be in Wokingham. Right. You've got the Eagle, which is a little one, Haywoods, Baker's, and the Wellington. And as you can see, 3 of them were actually in town. It's only Haywoods was out, along the Reading Road in that direction, because they weren't very big. We start with the Eagle. Not there anymore. Surprise, surprise. If you think about it, you could call all these beer houses breweries, but as I've said, the concept is a brewery makes a beer, somebody else sells it. And here's a brewery that made the transition. It opened in 1820 and sold beer to other people. The Beer Act allowed it to retail its own beer, so it obtained this off license and could sell its own beer. Then in 1854, the brewery was bought by Hewitt's Brewery of Waltham St. Lawrence, and then it seemed to be closed by 1863, but it carried on as a beer and spirits retailer. In other words, what we'd go to and buy some drinks from, until 1982 when it got taken over by somebody else. Now the big 3. Haywoods Brewery. This is the one on the Reading Road, out of town. Up until 1856, there's only one significant brewery in Wokingham. That William Haywood, who had bought the original business from James Webb. James Webb bought Beech's Manor, which used to be here, on Reading Road in 1760, and he started the brewery on that site. Beech's was named after its 14th century owners, the de la Beche family. In 1762, he bought the leathern bottle for £300 and began the tradition of tied houses where it owned the building. The licensee was obliged only or mainly to use the brewery's beers. And by 1856, this brewery owned 40% of all the ale houses and public houses in the area. When it was put up for auction, no other breweries in Wokingham were sufficiently large to put in an offer for many of its licensed premises. So most of them went to breweries outside Wokingham, such as Breakspears in Henley, Hewitt's in White Waltham, such as the Riddance, as we saw. The next one is, second largest, is the Baker's Brewery, or the Wokingham Brewery, Broad Street. The Wokingham Brewery is behind number 15, one of the properties that front onto Broad Street. Originally Baker's Brewery, and then it became known as the Wokingham Brewery late in the 19th century. And by this time it had acquired at least 4 public houses: the Crooked Billet, the Crown, the Hope and Anchor, and the Railway Hotel. In 1857, it opened the Shades, a public house on the road at the front, as we mentioned some time ago. And in 1901, Rosalind Baker, the Baker family, was still the owner. It was sold to Breakspears in 1914, but surprise, surprise, they only wanted its tied properties, not the brewery. And the brewery itself closed down early in the 1914-18 war. Although the building on the corner, which was the Shades, is still sort of recognizable, down the passageway there's all these new office developments where the brewery itself was located. And here's the sort of thing that they sold. This is the wholesale price list. On the left we have the beers, and they're selling it by the gallon or by a dozen bottles, because this is wholesale. So it's 10 pence per gallon for the cheapest beer, shilling, a little bit more for slightly better ones, 1 and 6pence for a strong one or a stout. Baker and Company's nourishing stout, recommended by the faculty, was 3 shillings for a dozen bottles. Pale Ale, 3 and 6. IPA, 2 and 6. Extra stout, 3 and 6. And you got 5% discount for cash. And they also did choice wines, Hungarian wines, pure Australian wine. They really, went to town. And on the right-hand side of the spirits, and interesting things. I like this. It says brandy, 24, 26, 28 shillings a gallon. Ditto brown brandy. Old Jamaica rum. Superior strong gin. And then gin and whiskey, Scotch or Irish. But this is the nice bit. Sherry, useful sherry, 16 shillings, 18 shillings. Dry dinner sherry, much more expensive, 24, 30 shillings. Old sherry, wow, 30 shillings, 42 shillings. And port, rich port from the wood was 16 shillings. Crusted port was 24. And old port was 48. And then you've got the French wines, and German wines, and Hungarian wines. And the trade is supplied on liberal terms, such as 5% discount for cash. Right, and the last one is the Wellington, or the Headington Brewery. In 1856, when the Haywoods Empire was being split up, Robert Tricky Dunnings bought the Chair in Denmark Street, as a pub, and he bought the land behind the Chair upon which he built the Wellington Brewery. It was taken over first by Frank Headington and his cousin Richard Webster in partnership, and then Frank's son John, and he was the owner in 1901. And it flourished until 1920 when it was sold to Ashby's of Staines. As usual, the new owners only wanted the Tide pubs. They didn't want the brewery. And the site of the brewery is where the Giggling Squid is now situated, behind the plaza. So that's the end of my little walk, our little walk. I hope you found it interesting and not too tiring. And if you want a little extra, at the bottom here, I have a website which goes to a little pub quiz. Not any old pub quiz, it's a 1901 pub quiz. And I'll email you all this link later on. Some of the answers I've mentioned, you should be able to get those if you've taken notes. I hope you've taken notes. You might have to look some up or just guess. 2 things to finish with. Rosemary Ings came up with a fascinating little gem yesterday. I love it when people you take on a walk come up with something you had no idea about. And she said, thank you, Rosemary, I used to know a rhyme that included the names of all the pubs in Wokingham. Unfortunately, I can only remember part of it. Perhaps my memory had been dulled by the refreshments I joined in them. And what she remembers is, on my way to the Poplars, to the Pin and Bowl I called in. Then in the Little Duke's Head, where they kept good beds, and the Crispin sold good gin. And finally, a big thank you to Diana for organising the Zoom. If you've got any questions, use chat. I'll try and answer them now. Or the good thing is, Diana can give me a list of all the chat later on, and I can, if I have to do some research, I can use that. Otherwise, cheerio. Thank you.
Chris, can I ask a cheeky question, please?
Of course.
As a foreigner in this country, I always wonder why so many pubs have the same name, the Crooked Billet, the Red Lion, the White Hart. Do you have any idea why? Obviously, in those days, people didn't have to trademark the name of the pub, but why so many pubs are called the same name up and down the country?
A good question. I don't know the definite answer. I can imagine that a lot of them were because they wanted a memorable name which people could remember. So if it was called the Red Lion and there weren't any within the town at the time, they thought, right, the Red Lion, people are going to remember that. The fact that if you went to, 20 miles down the road, there was another Red Lion, didn't really matter, because they thought, this is it. This is the Red Lion. Everybody will remember its name. No, I don't know the definitive answer, I'm afraid.
There's a question to you, Chris, from Charlie Pritchard.
Yep.
What about the Crispin?
The Crispin. Good question. I'll have to look that one up. Got a picture of a chap mending a boot, isn't he? I'll add that to my list of things to do. Thank you very much. Unless anybody knows the answer, they can chat. Tell me the answer.
There are lots of thank you messages to you, Chris.
Okay, that's good. Well, I'm glad some people enjoyed it. That's nice to know. Thank you.
I think this is about it now, Chris.
To look, yes. Right, everybody seems to be. Some people found it interesting, good, and they're still saying. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming along. Nice to see so many people. Thank you, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Righty ho. Cheers.
It was excellent, Chris. I've never been to so many pubs and been able to walk home afterwards. So.
That's the idea. Yeah. Good.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Cheers. Right. Okay.
Hi, Chris.
Righty ho then. Thank you very much. Right.
We've always intended to do a pub crawl of Wokingham. And never got round to it. We've been in Wokingham all these years.
Well,
maybe we've been encouraged to do it now.
yes, right. Good.
By the way, in the Finch Road, we've got the two poplars.
The two poplars, yes, that's right. Yeah.
I don't know how old it is, but it's been there quite a long time.
Yeah.
Still a going concern.
Yes, that's a good one. Yeah.
We hope.
I don't know whether the two poplars are still there, but the pub is dead.
I think the walking group met there for lunch after one of its walks.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, we did.
Yes, we started in Tesco's car park, if I remember.
Yeah.
I went for a short walk and then came back to there afterwards. Yes.
Yeah, and had a low-cost fish and chips.
Yeah, right. Good.
The pin and bowl was where the Pets R Us is.
Where the what's that? Sorry?
You know where Pets R Us?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes.
Pin and bowl was there.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I have a photograph of that. Unfortunately, that's all. There's nothing much now.
No.
And there was another one in Rose Street. I went to take a picture of it and thought, this is not very interesting. It's a large brick wall next to Waitrose car park, and it shows nothing at all. I won't bother with that one. But I'll send out a link to my quiz, and I'll send out a link to the whole of the research that I did, in case anybody wants to browse through that at some time.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, I'll send it out to everybody. Right here.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you for a lovely talk.
Okay,
Chris.
thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. It was a change, I thought, as well. Change from walking. Although I would have liked to have done my Odeon walk, but one of these days I'll see if I can help Sally with that as well. Okay then. All right, thank you for recording it. I hope that works out as well. And thank you for organising everything as usual. Right, I'll say goodbye. Bye.
Bye for now. Bye.